History is brought home from those who experience it. With the shared stories and experiences, we are able to learn from each other, learn from our mistakes, and look to build a brighter future. My grandfather lived through events that shaped the lives of generations. He grew up with immigrant parents. He survived World War II. He was a physics teacher throughout the Cold War, and he advocated for peace for not-so-peaceful places. His life's blend of American stories lead us not just through his life, but through the lives of countless other Americans on their own journeys. My grandfather, Lawrence Joseph Griffin, was born September 7th, 1923, in Suffolk, Massachusetts, to Irish immigrant parents, James Lawrence Griffin and Mary Josephine O'Connor. Mary O'Connor traveled to America from Dingle, County Kerry, Ireland, in 1905. James Griffin traveled to America from Gordaleen, Kilgarry, Lander, Kerry, Ireland, in 1912. Their families in Ireland probably faced challenging times, from the hardships of the Great Famine to the many evictions of Irish peasants and farmers by English landlords. Once the O'Connors and Griffins made it to America, they strived for a better life, like the one promised by the American dream. Mary O'Connor and James Griffin married in 1921 in Brookline, Massachusetts. They had 3 boys: my grandfather Larry, then Jimmy, then John. The 3 brothers grew up during the Great Depression. Times were tough, especially for an immigrant family living on servant wages. James and Mary were both servants on the Brandegee estate in Brookline. The Griffin family lived in the servants' quarters on the estate. When Larry was young, he loved to visit his Aunt Noni. He would stay there over the summers in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and play with his 7 cousins. However, his Aunt Noni's husband, John, was unemployed, and they had to support 7 children. Larry wouldn't realize his guilt for staying with them until later, for he was another mouth to feed with a family of 9. Larry went to grade school at St. Thomas Aquinas School in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. In St. Thomas School, he met nun Sister Rose Gabriel. She was very influential in his life and helped him get into Boston College High School. In 1942, Larry's father James passed away, and then a year later, after being sick for quite some time, Larry's mother Mary passed away. After the deaths of both of their parents, Larry's youngest brother, John, who was just 11, went to live with their 3 aunts, while Jimmy and Larry joined the Army. At 19, Larry enlisted in World War II after completing 1 year at Boston College. He was shipped off to Camp Maxey training camp in Lamar, Texas. Larry wrote a short story published in the Stylus of Boston College in the spring of 1946 about his friend Tom Mann, who he had met at Camp Maxey. He wrote of Tom's difficulties in the war and his subsequent death overseas, which must have affected Larry greatly. Larry wanted to be a Navy aviator. However, he failed the test, so instead he was made a radio operator. After several months of training, Larry was shipped to England on one of the many emergency construction Liberty ships. Larry was a part of the 158th Engineer Combat, who specialized in the construction of pontoon bridges and a wide variety of construction services. Larry was a part of the largest seaborne invasions in history, the invasion of Normandy. He was involved in Operation Fortitude, which was an intricate plan to hide the secret location of where and when the Allied forces would invade German forces. He wrote on June 6, 1944, that he had broken camp in Stroud, England, and that they were on their way out. Larry was a part of a decoy unit that was sent to threaten France. 12 days after the invasion, Larry and his fellow combatants were then sent to Omaha Beach in Normandy. As a radio operator, Larry had to go on monthly check-ins with the headquarters company. And on December 16, 1944, He was at headquarters while many of his friends and fellow combatants were fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. He lost many of his friends to that deadly battle. Near the end of the war, Larry and his outfit were waiting to be shipped off to the Pacific Theater, but then Truman ordered the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the war. My grandfather was finally able to go back home. If the war hadn't ended then, there could have been a good chance he wouldn't have made it back home. Larry received the Army of Occupation Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, and the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal for serving in the European theater. When he was sent back to America, he was discharged in Camp Devens in the towns of Eyre and Shirley, Massachusetts. Many years later, Larry wrote a letter titled "Many Miles from Home" to a local newspaper expressing his views about the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He wrote, "I'm writing this letter 6 days before the fateful January 15th deadline in the Middle East, thinking about the 55,000 GIs who died in Korea and the more than 50,000 who died in Vietnam, and the countless number of Koreans and Vietnamese who also died. Many of these tough, brave soldiers were really children who in their innocence had no true understanding of what it was all about, nor how little value was placed on their lives by their powerful and safe leaders. So they died by the thousands in the snow and cold in Korea and in the rice paddies of Vietnam, thousands of miles from the comfort of their loved ones." My grandfather was only 19 years old when he enlisted in World War II. He knew what these soldiers had experienced and did not wish for any brave souls to be lost. Once Larry got home, he was able to reunite with his brothers and finish college. He, like many other World War II veterans, benefited from the GI Bill and was able to continue at Boston College. He then continued his path of education by entering in a master's program at Fordham, where he received a degree in psychology. After he got his master's degree, he worked at various juvenile delinquent facilities in New York. After a couple years, he traveled to Berryville, Virginia, to become a monk at the Holy Cross Abbey Monastery. Christianity had always been a driving force in his life. At the monastery, he made good friends and mentors. After 2 years, my grandfather was told that he did not have a vocation at the monastery. So he went back to Boston, keeping with him lasting bonds with the monks and priests he had spent his time with. Back in Boston, Larry worked odd jobs until he desired to be a guidance counselor. In Massachusetts, you couldn't become a guidance counselor without having at least 1 year of teaching. He took a silver train all the way to Fort Kent, Maine, where he found a teaching job as a chemistry teacher, biology teacher, and physics teacher. My grandmother, Lorraine Martin, worked as an English teacher in Fort Kent and was on her way towards getting a master's degree during her summers. Lorraine grew up in Bangor, Maine with French-Acadian parents. After spending time with each other for about 6 weeks, Lorraine and Larry got engaged in 1956, then married in June. That summer, they traveled down to Cambridge so Larry could take summer classes at Harvard to get his Master's of Education. Shortly thereafter, their first child was born, Mary Teresa Griffin. Then came Joseph Patrick Griffin. Then there was Catherine Ann Griffin. Then Paul John Griffin. Then Eileen Joan Griffin. Then Michael James Griffin, my father. Then finally, Patricia Jean Griffin. All 7 children lived and went to school in Old Town, Maine. Larry taught in Orono High School as a physics teacher, and Lorraine was a substitute teacher. Many of Larry's summers were spent at physics classes provided by universities. The U.S. government encouraged the growth of science programs in schools across the country in response to the arms and space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Science teachers were getting the latest information and the newest insights in their fields. During these summer classes, Lorraine was often left alone to look after her 7 children with the occasional help from a babysitter. In 1988, after 29 years of teaching physics, Larry retired. However, his retirement did not stop him from being an active participant in the community. Larry's actions were often guided by his faith to help the powerless, and he and Lorraine joined a group called PICA, Peace in Central America. Their group protests the U.S. government's involvement in support of the Contra group in Nicaragua. PICA supported the Sandinista Party of Laborers and protested the U.S. statesmen that had been involved in supporting the elites of Nicaragua. One day, PICA organized a march and sit-in in front of the offices of Olympia Stowe, the Maine senator. Eventually, the police showed up and then arrested Larry. Some people around town saw him on the news get dragged away on his butt by a police officer. Larry and Lorraine raised 7 amazing, empathetic, generous, talented, and loving people. I'm so lucky to have one be my dad. My grandfather, Lawrence Joseph Griffin, died September 28, 2009 in Old Town, Maine. I may not have known him for that long, but his century-long story is ingrained within this country's history, this country itself, and around the world. When learning about my grandfather's past, the lessons of the 20th century history were brought home. They were no longer so distant. This history was a part of our family.